The heavy iron crowbar shattered the wood of the altar with a deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot through the empty, dusty sanctuary. Rain lashed against the stained-glass windows of the Grace Fellowship Church, but inside, the only sound was the desperate, ragged breathing of 15-year-old Chloe. Shards of varnished oak flew across the floorboards as she threw her entire weight into the lever once more, her hands slick with sweat and grime. Outside, the low, mechanical rumble of an idling excavator vibrated through the foundation, a monstrous reminder that the demolition crew was waiting for the rain to clear. She didn't have hours, she had minutes. With a final, agonizing wrench of her shoulders, the floorboards gave way, exposing a dark, hollow cavity beneath the pulpit. Chloe dropped the crowbar, her fingers trembling violently as she reached into the cobwebs and pulled out a battered, leather-bound notebook. The cover was stained with something dark and ancient, a deep crimson that had turned to a rusted brown over the decades. As she flipped it open, a faded, water-damaged photograph from 1996 slipped out, showing two young boys smiling under an old oak tree. Beneath the photo lay a document stamped with a terrifying federal seal, United States Marshal Service, Witness Security Division. Chloe stared at the official text, her heart hammering against her ribs as the pieces of a lethal, heartbreaking puzzle finally locked into place. To understand the blood on the leather, she had to look back to exactly 3 weeks ago, on a Sunday morning when the air was thick with the scent of ozone and an impending storm. But before then, leave a comment on where you are watching from and the time. 3 weeks earlier, the sanctuary had been filled not with silence, but with the tense, anxious whispers of a dying congregation. The church was drowning in unpayable debt, and everyone in the small rural town knew the bank was preparing to foreclose. Chloe's father, Reverend Thomas, stood at the pulpit, his voice straining to inject hope into a sermon about endurance. But Chloe wasn't listening to her father. From her seat near the audio booth, her sharp eyes were locked on a stranger sitting in the very back row. The man looked to be in his early 60s, wearing a travel-worn coat that seemed far too heavy for the humid morning. He wasn't praying, and he wasn't listening. His entire body twitched with an erratic, frantic energy. He was sweating profusely, his pale hands fumbling with an old flip phone. Chloe watched in confusion as the man suddenly produced a pair of small metal tweezers from his pocket, violently digging into the side of the phone to pry out the SIM card. He snapped the tiny piece of plastic in half, his teeth grinding together in what looked like absolute terror. Reverend Thomas stopped preaching mid-sentence. The silence in the room became heavy and suffocating. The minister glared down from the altar, his eyes fixed on the disruptive stranger. Thomas assumed the worst, believing this man was a scout sent by the ruthless out-of-town developers who had been aggressively hounding him to sign over the church property. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium, his knuckles turning white as he spoke directly into the microphone. "We have guests today who seem more interested in their devices than the word of comfort," Thomas said, his voice dripping with defensive anger. "Perhaps if the world outside is too loud, it is best to step out of this sanctuary." The stranger flinched as if he had been struck. He looked up, his eyes wide, hollow, and suddenly swimming with tears, meeting Thomas's harsh gaze for a split second. A wave of profound, unreadable agony crossed the old man's face, a look of pure heartbreak that pierced right through Chloe. Without a word, he stumbled out of the pew, knocking over a hymnal, and bolted through the heavy double doors into the pouring rain. Thomas cleared his throat and tried to resume his sermon, but Chloe couldn't shake the image of the man's trembling hands and shattered expression. The congregation saw an aggressive, rude outsider, but Chloe saw a biological countdown. Her sharp radar hadn't been born from curiosity, it was a ghost she carried from her late mother, Sarah. Before cancer took her 3 years prior, Sarah had been the county's only dedicated night shift ER nurse. She had spent years drilling a strict creed into Chloe during long, late-night drives. "In a small town, people hide their worst pain in plain sight, Chloe. Their faces will always lie to you, but watch their hands. Their hands will tell you when they are drowning. When Sarah fell ill, 15-year-old Chloe became her primary caretaker. In that quiet, sterile bedroom, Chloe's observation skills were forged in fire. She learned to read the shallow rhythm of a failing lung, to notice the subtle, violent tremors of a hand struggling to grip a glass of water, and to anticipate a medical crisis before the machines even beeped. Looking at the stranger in the back pew, she didn't see an insult to her father's sermon, she saw the exact, frantic, suffocating panic she had watched across her mother's deathbed. It was muscle memory that drove her out into that blinding rainstorm. She refused to let another soul die alone in the dark. She pushed through the exit doors, stepping directly into a wall of blinding, torrential rain. The churchyard was completely obscured by sheets of gray water, the wind howling through the branches of the ancient oaks. Chloe shielded her eyes, scanning the empty parking lot. The stranger hadn't gone to a car. Instead, she caught a glimpse of his dark coat vanishing into the overgrown, neglected historic cemetery that bordered the church grounds. Where is he going? Chloe muttered to herself, her boots sinking into the thick mud as she ran after him. The deeper she walked into the cemetery, the more the atmospheric pressure seemed to drop. The grave markers from the 1800s loomed like jagged teeth through the fog. She lost sight of him for several minutes, the storm swallowing all tracks. She was about to turn back when she heard a horrific, choking sound echoing from the crumbling stone mausoleum at the far edge of the property. Chloe sprinted toward the stone structure, her breath catching in her throat. Inside the dark, damp mausoleum, the stranger was on his knees, clawing frantically at his own throat. His face had turned a terrifying, bluish-purple shade, his chest lifting in violent, unproductive gasps. On the stone floor beside him lay an overturned bottle of water and a crushed, lifeless wasp. The man was suffering from acute, severe anaphylactic shock from an accidental sting, and his airway was closing completely. "Help me," his eyes begged, wide with the primal terror of a man looking into the abyss, though no sound could escape his swollen throat. Chloe dropped to her knees beside him, her mind racing. She reached into her pockets, searching for her phone, but there was absolutely no cellular service in the remote valley during a storm. She knew that if she ran back to the church to get her father, this man would be dead before she reached the front doors. His body convulsed violently, his eyes rolling back as he began to lose consciousness. "I've got you," Chloe cried, tears mixing with the rain on her face as she tried to keep her voice steady despite the absolute terror screaming in her mind. "Look at me. Hold on." Her mother's clinical voice echoed in her head, "An obstructed airway gives you 4 minutes. No more. Clear it or lose them." Chloe's hands flew to her backpack, tearing open the front pocket. She pulled out a heavy, metal-barreled tactical pen her father had given her for protection. Unscrewing the cap, she emptied the ink cartridge, leaving a hollow, sharp metal tube. "Forgive me," she whispered, her hands shaking as she pinned the man's shoulders to the stone floor. She located the small, soft depression in his throat just below the Adam's apple, the cricothyroid membrane. With a desperate prayer on her lips, she pressed the sharp point of the hollow pen downward, applying steady, firm pressure until she felt the distinct pop of the tissue giving way. A sharp, wet hiss of air rushed through the hollow tube. The stranger's chest rose with a sudden, violent expansion. He gasped greedily through the tiny metal pipe, his hands gripping Chloe's wrists with surprising, fierce strength. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with an overwhelming mixture of shock, pain, and profound gratitude. She held the tube perfectly still in the howling darkness of the mausoleum, counting the agonizing minutes as his skin color slowly shifted from blue back to a pale gray, her own tears dripping onto his coat. By the time the storm began to break an hour later, Chloe had managed to drag the weakened man toward the main road, where a passing motorist finally called for an ambulance. As the paramedics loaded the stranger onto a stretcher, one of his pockets gave way, dropping a heavy, leather-bound notebook into the mud. Chloe quietly picked it up, intending to return it at the hospital. Later that evening, the sterile, fluorescent lights of the county hospital ICU offered a stark contrast to the stormy darkness of the cemetery. Barth, as the medical charts now identified him, lay asleep under heavy sedation, a proper medical breathing tube finally replacing Chloe's emergency pen. Thomas stood outside the glass window of the ICU, his arms crossed, his face a mask of stubborn disapproval. "You shouldn't have risked your life for him, Chloe," he said, his voice low and stern. "The town is saying he's a drifter, or worse, someone connected to the people trying to take our church. We don't know him." Chloe didn't answer right away. She sat on the waiting room chair, pulling the damp, mud-stained notebook from her bag. She unclasped the leather strap. "Dad, look at this," she said softly. Thomas sighed, walking over to glance over her shoulder. Chloe opened the cover, revealing the faded photograph of the two young boys from 1996. The clergyman froze. The breath completely left his lungs. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers touching the glossy, water-damaged paper. "Where did you get this?" Thomas whispered, his voice suddenly cracking, stripped of all its pastoral authority. "It fell out of his coat, Dad," Chloe said, watching her father's face drain of all color. "Who are they?" Thomas didn't speak. He turned his head slowly to look through the glass window at the old man lying in the hospital bed. He looked at the shape of the jaw, the faint scar running along the stranger's hairline, and a realization hit him like a physical blow. He staggered backward, catching himself against the wall, suffocating on his own breath. "It's impossible," Thomas breathed, his eyes wide with an ancient horror and a sudden, violent grief. "He's dead. He's been dead for 30 years. Dad, talk to me," Chloe pleaded, standing up and grabbing his arm. "Who is he?" "That's my older brother, Barth," Thomas sobbed, his voice breaking into a whimper as he fell into a chair. In 1996, he was arrested for working with the regional drug syndicate that used to run this county. The police told me he was killed by rivals while waiting for trial in his cell. They gave me a closed casket. I buried him, Chloe. I buried my own brother. I've mourned him every single day." As Thomas wept, the pieces of a darker history began to unfold through the documents tucked deep inside the notebook. The omniscient truth of the past rewound 30 years, to a dimly lit interrogation room where a young, terrified Barth sat across from federal agents. Barth hadn't been a willing criminal, he had been a low-level accountant trapped by dangerous men. When the syndicate threatened to slaughter his entire family, including his teenage brother, Barth made a deal with the devil. He agreed to testify, providing the government with the financial records needed to dismantle the entire cartel. But the cartel's reach was long. To ensure the safety of everyone involved, the U.S. Marshals executed a complete erasure. They fabricated a fatal incident within the prison system, presenting the world, and Barth's own family, with a flawless lie. Barth was given a new name, a new history, and was sent thousands of miles away into the deepest shadows of the witness security program. For 3 decades, he lived as a ghost, watching his brother's life from afar through newspaper clippings and internet obituaries, never allowed to send a single letter, never allowed to say goodbye. He had sacrificed his very existence so his little brother could grow up safely to become a minister. Thomas pushed open the door to the ICU room, his boots clicking softly on the linoleum. He walked to the side of the bed, staring down at the brother he had buried in his mind decades ago. Barth's eyes fluttered open, the sedation wearing off. He looked up at Thomas, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. The weight of 30 years of enforced silence and stolen lives hung heavily in the air between them. "Thomas?" Barth croaked, his voice raw from the breathing tubes, his frail hand reaching up. "You're alive," Thomas said, falling to his knees by the bedside, his shoulders shaking violently as he took his brother's hand. "They told me you were gone. Why didn't you find a way to tell me?" "I needed you, Barth." "I couldn't," Barth whispered, tears streaming freely down his wrinkled face. "If they knew I was alive, they would have come for you. I died so you could live, Thomas. Every day without you was a living hell, but you were safe. That was all that mattered. Then why come back now?" Thomas asked, his grief turning into a sharp, desperate confusion. "Why risk everything to sit in the back of my church?" Barth swallowed hard, squeezing his brother's hand with what little strength he had left. "Because the doctors told me I have 3 months left. Cancer, Thomas. It's eating me alive. I didn't want to die in a house full of government furniture with a name that doesn't belong to me. I just wanted to hear you preach one last time. I wanted to see your face. I wanted to be your brother again, just for an hour." Chloe stood in the doorway, her heart breaking for the two men. In a cruel twist of fate, the cancer her mother fought so hard against in others was now taking the uncle she had just fought to save. But as she looked down at the notebook still in her hands, her eyes caught a detail she had missed before. On the back of the federal document, there was a series of recent, handwritten dates and geographic coordinates. The last entry was dated just 2 days ago, right here in their town. "Barth," Chloe said, stepping into the room, her voice tense with a sudden, chilling realization. "When you came here, did you follow the protocol? Did you change your vehicle? Did you disable your tracking devices?" Bartha's face went pale. I was careless," he muttered, his eyes filled with a sudden horror. "I didn't care anymore. I knew I was dying. I just bought a burner phone and came." "The burner phone," Chloe said, her blood turning to ice. "The SIM card you were trying to destroy in the church. It wasn't because you were panicked about the service." Barth closed his eyes in shame, a tear cutting through the dust on his cheek. "I realized too late. Someone had compromised my secure email accounts a week ago. When I arrived in town, I noticed a black SUV following my rental car. In the church, I saw the signal bars on my phone flashing weirdly. They tracked the device. They know I'm here." The revelation shattered the fragile reunion. Barth hadn't just brought himself back to his hometown, he had inadvertently brought the dying embers of a deadly cartel vendetta straight to his brother's doorstep. The men who had been hounding Thomas to buy the church land weren't corporate developers at all. They were the descendants of the very syndicate Barth had destroyed 30 years ago, still operating in the shadows, waiting for the ghost to finally reappear so they could exact their final, bloody revenge. "We have to go," Thomas said, panic seizing his chest as he tried to lift his brother. "We have to get you out of this hospital right now." "No," Barth said, his voice suddenly firm, filled with a grim, final authority. He pushed Thomas away. "If we run together, they kill us all. 30 years ago, I made a choice to protect you by vanishing. It's time to finish it." Before Thomas or Chloe could stop him, Barth pulled the medical monitors from his skin, the machines erupting into a chorus of shrill, panicked beeps. He swung his legs over the bed, his frail body trembling but fueled by an intense, desperate adrenaline. He looked at Chloe, his eyes fiercely bright through his tears. "Your kindness saved my life in that graveyard, little girl. You gave me 24 more hours with my brother. You gave me my name back. Don't let them take that away." Barth grabbed his coat from the closet, slipping out into the hospital's rear exit stairwell before the medical staff could respond to the alarms. He vanished into the night, using himself as a deliberate, glowing decoy to draw the cartel scouts away from the hospital, away from his brother, and away from the church. He was going to die, but he was going to die protecting them one last time. Chloe stood in the ruined sanctuary, holding the bloody notebook she had just recovered from Barth's secret hiding place beneath the altar floorboards, the place he must have hidden it during his final flight before the cartel caught up with him. He had made it back to the church one last time, leaving behind his final legacy. The heavy thud of a car door closing outside broke her trance. Chloe ran to the window. A man in a tailored suit stepped out of a black vehicle, walking toward the church doors with a clipboard in hand. It was the lead representative of the development firm that had threatened foreclosure. Chloe gripped the notebook tight, her knuckles white as she walked out to meet him on the church steps, her father standing by her side, his face aged, stained with tears, but resolved. "You're wasting your time," the representative said, offering a cold, victorious smile. "The deadline passed at noon. The bank has transferred the deed to our holding company. The demolition begins today." Chloe stepped forward, bypassing her father. She opened the leather notebook, pulling out a certified, freshly stamped Federal Treasury document that Barth had finalized hours before his final disappearance. It was a complete, irrevocable transfer of his entire life savings, millions of dollars accumulated under his protected federal identity, designated entirely to pay off the Grace Fellowship Church's debt in full. "You're wrong," Chloe said, her voice ringing out clear, steady, and filled with a fierce emotion against the sound of the idling machinery. "The debt was settled 3 hours ago via wire transfer. This property belongs to this community. And it always will. You can't touch it." The representative's smile vanished as he took the document, his eyes scanning the official federal confirmation numbers. His face twisted in disbelief and rage. He looked up at the girl, then at the old church, realizing that the ghost of Barth had won the final war from beyond the grave. Without a word, he turned on his heel, signaling the excavator to shut down its engines. As the heavy machinery rolled away, leaving the churchyard in a profound, triumphant silence, Thomas placed a shaking hand on Chloe's shoulder. He looked down at the photograph of the 2 young boys, weeping softly, knowing he would never see his brother again, but knowing that Barth had died a free man, saving the people he loved. Chloe looked out over the quiet cemetery, understanding that a single act of kindness born from her mother's memory had completely rewritten the history of their lives. It proved that even in the darkest storms, love always finds a way back home. If you enjoyed this story, tell us someone that has made a sacrifice for your family. Like and subscribe for more moving stories like this.